Welcome, everyone. I hope you're having a great day. And my name is Matthew Hora. I'm an associate professor of adult and higher education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm also the co-director of the Center for Research on College to Workforce Transitions with my colleague, Mindy Thompson. And my training, just really quickly, so you have a sense of where I'm coming from with a lot of these topics on career readiness and teaching and learning, is from the learning sciences. My PhD is in educational psychology, but I also have a background in cultural anthropology. And so you're going to see a lot of the cultural analyses come through in how I think about learning, instructional design, and career readiness. So these 1-hour webinars, which this is the last one, I really designed these to share some of these ideas about instructional design and career readiness with a broad platform. One of the missions of our center is outreach and education, where we hope to get cutting edge research and ideas for practitioners out into the world beyond peer-reviewed articles and academic conferences, which is where most of us academics ply our trade. Our center also does applied research on college internships, student well-being and mental health, community cultural wealth for students of color, and this career readiness research. And these webinars, I intended, again, to help get the word out about some of these ideas, but I'm also redesigning an online faculty development course. It's a 7-week online course for faculty, and I'm totally redesigning it for edX, but also a UW-Madison Canvas course. And so these webinars have been great because I've been getting really good feedback from scholars and practitioners like yourselves about things to tweak, questions, and general feedback. So if you have any feedback for me about this webinar and these ideas, I'd be very happy to hear. And when I show my slides in a second, which I've also posted on slideshare.net, you'll see my contact information, so please get in touch. And with that, I will start sharing my screen. Okay. Is that showing up as a small little slide or a big slide? Can somebody let me know?
Small.
Small. Let's fix that. 2.5 years into this Zoom thing, I'm still figuring stuff out. But this is a PowerPoint thing. There, that should be better, right?
Looks good.
Awesome. Okay, so there's my contact information. If anybody wants to reach out, questions, comments, please feel free. And again, this is a workshop. It's a framework called Career Readiness Across the Curriculum. Today, I'll be just sharing some real brief thumbnail sketch about core ideas and to illustrate some of the ideas about how to teach transferable skills in college classrooms. I'll be focusing on teamwork skills today. So the goals of the session, I want to review some of the limitations with current discourses around skills and career readiness, talk about the cultural nature of skills and how the challenge for educators is to really introduce our students to the cultural aspect of some of the normative behaviors in our fields and professions. Also want us all to reflect on cultural scripts in our own fields. And then we're going to review some methods for teaching teamwork and collaboration. So to preface, one of the problems that I think we are facing in higher education today is career readiness is becoming a ubiquitous idea and is driving a lot of institutional strategies. And soft skills or non-cognitive skills, 21st century skills, whatever you want to call them, they're often at the heart of these initiatives. But do we really have a common understanding of what these skills are and then how to teach them to our students? I would hazard an answer that the answer is no, except for in small pockets of innovation and where people have really been talking about these for a long time. But for too many institutions, the answer is no. Another question I would pose is consider a typical academic program or department. Do all courses feature key skills or career-related information? Do all faculty know how to effectively teach these skills? And does anyone know within a department or a program? So these are some of the problems of practice I would pose to you all that we need to consider as a profession. So some of the background to how I'm approaching these questions. The focus on career readiness as a scholar of higher education, I think is fantastic. It's overdue. For too many institutions, such as my own, a research university, thinking about careers was kind of seen as something a professional program or a community college should do. And so it's great that everybody's talking about it. The problem is this idea of career readiness has similar challenges to the idea of employability, which is a construct that's really popular in Europe and Australia. And some of the critiques of that idea of employability is that too many people thought all a student needs to do to get a job is to have the right skills. And that's been critiqued for decades as being overly simplistic, that students' acquisition of jobs is due to a whole lot of other factors, such as global pandemics or business cycles or hiring discrimination. And so that's one of the first questions or issues that I bring to this issue of career readiness. The second is that when we think about skills, the dominant view of soft skills or non-cognitive skills is that they're generic and decontextualized aptitudes, that teamwork is just something that we can use and deploy in any situation, and it doesn't really matter the context. One of the corollaries to this, unfortunately, has been a tendency to think that they're easy to teach and easy for students to learn. And this has been really reflected in the lack of attention to faculty development. And to really thinking about, well, how can we train faculty, which in higher education, many of us are never trained how to teach at all. There hasn't been enough attention to how can we help faculty teach these skills. One of the other things that the discourse ignores is how skills are culturally shaped. And by this, I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but the real thing I think we need to think about now in an era where there's a lot of attention to discrimination and DEI and equity is how skills and how we think about them in normative views of skills can encode bias and discrimination. This is something that's almost completely absent from the career readiness and soft skills discourse. And then finally, one of the core things that's really kind of fueled a lot of my research in this area is discovering that work-based learning, like internships, are taken by just 30% of college students in the United States. And a lot of other students, that 70%, want to take them, but can't. And so the reasons being they have to work, they have families to care for, they don't have a car, and so forth. And so I'm turning a lot of attention, and some other countries are too, especially Australia, to work integrated learning, WIL. But even that, Australia, to their credit, are doing a great job in training faculty. But like I mentioned before, WIL is much easier said than done because faculty need training in some of these pedagogical approaches. So that's some of the background. This framework that I developed with my colleagues, it's really a three-part approach to thinking more culturally about these skills and how to embed them in the classroom, and then how to work as an institution or a college or a department to do some curricular mapping to think about, well, how can we get these in all of the courses and extracurriculars that students are going to be taking? That's a whole day-long conversation, all three of these steps. So today I'll be mostly focusing on the second part. Okay, and the first core idea behind a lot of this framework is that skills are best thought of as elements of culture. Too often, like I just said, they're thought of as static or decontextualized bits of knowledge that maybe you can pick up teamwork skills in a short course or workshop. But these are really complex human behaviors. They encode many assumptions about how people should act, how people should work in teams, communicate. And I think when we reflect on this just for a minute, it becomes kind of common sense that, yeah, these skills are really complicated, nuanced, and situational. To illustrate this, I'll direct your attention to this word cloud on the right of the screen. These are data that I collected from manufacturers and biotechnology employers in the state of Wisconsin about the skills that they really are looking for in college graduates. You can see some of the usual suspects are here: work ethic, technical ability, communication, lifelong learning. But work ethic was far and away the #1 skill that people talked about. And when we pushed a little bit, we uncovered this really rich, textured, nuanced kind of, hornet's nest of ideas, such as a very common one here in Wisconsin. We want to hire kids who grew up on farms that have a strong work ethic, because people from farms, they know how to problem solve, work long hours, and so forth. And when we pushed a little bit further, people would bring up the Protestant work ethic, which obviously has some connotations about religion and assumptions about how people view the world. And so some of these terms, which we see in these lists of skills employers want, communication, work ethic, they're really encoding a whole lot of belief and assumptions about the world. The second point I want to make is that different racial and ethnic groups, nationalities, and especially disciplines have very unique views on which versions of these skills are correct or appropriate. And this is a point where, again, if we reflect just for a moment on the way different cultural groups think of appropriate communication, that this point becomes pretty apparent. I'm half Japanese, and so I've grown up in a biracial household and communities, and oral communication is one of the obvious ones where I can see very stark differences between how Japanese culture approaches things like eye contact with superiors or elders versus my mother's white Southern family. And so once we think about it a little bit, we could think of gender, age, what part of the country we're from. Each of these shapes normative views about what's good or appropriate teamwork or critical thinking or communication. The last point I'd like to share with you is that once we think about this and we extend it to our professions, we think about nursing or mechanical engineering or social science as unique cultural groups, which they are. One of the tasks for us as educators is to train our students so that they can master these cultural skills so that they can enter the professions. This is a basic idea in work-based learning, in apprenticeships and internships, where our students are being socialized into the culture of these professions. But it's something that we haven't translated that idea to classroom instruction and the soft skills or career readiness discourse well enough yet. Okay. So as we think about skills in a cultural fashion, one of the ideas I brought from cognitive psychology is the idea of scripts. And basically, research has shown that the way that human beings internalize cultural information or any information is often in sequential knowledge structures that we store in our long-term memories. And so research on scripts has shown that these are routinized sequences of actions tied to how you act or perform in specific situations that are considered normal to particular groups. A very famous one is a script for ordering in a restaurant, where you enter the restaurant, you sit down, you receive a menu, you look at it, and then you tell the server. That's a script that over time becomes so habituated and so normal that we don't even think about it. Another one in healthcare that medical educators are really thinking about and intentionally training is how do you break bad news to patients? And they've developed a script for finding a quiet location, asking about the well-being of the patient, and so forth. One that I teach to my students is a script for giving a poster at an academic meeting. You dress nicely, you stand off to the side, you make eye contact, but not too obtrusively, and so forth. And so each of us can think in our professions or our disciplines, numerous scripts that we often perform unconsciously, but that we consider normal, and we consider something that experts in that disciplinary community are kind of experts with or masters of. So again, rethinking of skills as cultural scripts. I just want to briefly go over this slide. This is from some field research we did in Houston with some nursing educators and nursing faculty about how experts think about oral communication. And really briefly, this is a network graph of all the different ways they defined communication and then how they linked them together. And you can see that they had a really complicated, nuanced, interconnected notion of what oral communication is, where it's establishing intersubjectivity or common understanding between different people in a team. And you do this through question and answering, active listening, and especially translating jargon. And that the different people in this team are often specialists, nurses, family members, and the patient. This takes place at very specific physical locations, the bedside and the nursing station. And then beyond this oral communication competencies, they spoke about this needs to also kind of be grounded in situational awareness of the big picture. All the while, the whole goal is to express empathy and to make sure the patients are safe. When we contrasted this with the students' notions of oral communication, as you can guess, they were far more simplified, far more not interconnected. And so part of the challenge that we see in taking our students from the novice to this expert phase is how do we guide them as instructional designers from this novice to expert communication or teamwork behaviors. And how can we do it in a way that really introduces them to authentic real-world workplace practices? And so this is really reframing some of the questions around career readiness and soft skills instruction to a more, becomes a problem or a question about socialization and enculturation into the professions, which, as you can guess, if you've ever tried to teach a young person about entrance into different cultural groups, it's no easy thing. And so if you have a writing utensil, I'd like you to get that out now, pen or paper, your laptop, and I'd like you just to jot down the skill-related cultural script from your own profession. And as you do this, try to think really clearly about what situation does it take place in, what's the skill, and does it have a sequence of behaviors? And then if you have any thoughts on ways that race or ethnicity, class, gender, or other identities impact that skill, that would be great. And if something occurs to you, just put it in the chat and share with everybody on the call. And this is a nice small group today. So if anybody wants to just, share verbally what you came up with, that would be great. Or you can put it in the chat. Okay, would anyone like to share the script? If not, that's fine, and I can keep on going.
I can jump in. Hi, Professor Hora. My name is Wendy Shoemaker. I work at the University of Kansas, and I'll give it a go. So, so one of the cultural skill-related cultural scripts. I work in the Career Center, and so walking around talking with employers at a career fair. And so that would be demonstrating assertiveness, knowing who to approach, using judgment about like, well, this is a busy employer and that employer doesn't have anybody to talk to. There's some of that subtle reading of the room kinds of stuff. But then also engaging in small talk, what kinds of topics are, appropriate for that moment and what's liked, and probing for important information about like, what are you hiring for, and skills and things like that. And then also finally triaging that information in an appropriate manner. So like if there's a follow-up or a need for follow-up or something like that, knowing who to approach or how do you, who gets that information and things like that. And so there's a lot of judgment in that because employers are probably sharing lots of information and requesting information too. So that's the script, if you will. And then I think in terms of the second part of your question is, looks like somebody else has answered very similar things. Race, ethnicity, class, gender. I'm thinking that there's a lot of nuance in there. Gender would definitely play a part in terms of how you're negotiating the room, who you're approaching, what would be appropriate, what kinds of questions you're asking. But any one of those things in terms of class, race, ethnicity would impact the kinds of questions, the confidence this person would feel about brokering conversations, especially if something was brought up from the employer that felt a little icky. I don't know how else to say it, but and so how would this person be empowered to negotiate that discussion and move that and change that discussion. So I think, and then you don't have age in there, but I think I would put age in there in that space too. So
that's great. Thank you so much, Wendy, for sharing that. And that strikes me as a cultural script that has definite unique elements, which Lindsley also mentioned, that could be for a career services professional, or I would hazard maybe for academic affairs, student affairs, where some of these things, working with employers, people that are external to the institution, there may be some unique twists where you would want to teach a room full of students hoping to go into student affairs or career services about this script. But there's definitely elements of this that could just be more generic networking, right? Like, how do you work a room? How do you triage important information? And so this is the case, and I think with many cultural scripts for our professions, where there are some generic elements that could be taught to multiple different students to their benefit, but then there's some that are unique to professions where the students may be going into. And I emphasize this because some of the questions I get about this exercise are, well, what if I teach chemistry or history? And I don't know where the students are going, and they're going into like 100 different professions. And that's where I think identifying scripts like this that could apply to many different contexts, situations, and professions is really important, but then grounding it into a very particular and specific example so students know what it looks like in the workplace. So thank you very much, Wendy and Lindsley, for sharing that. And we will move on. So one of the reasons that I'm really emphasizing classroom-based cultural script instruction, again, has to do with work integrated learning. And I just briefly want to talk about why this emphasis is on the classroom as the space or venue for learning. Career services is obviously an incredibly rich and professionalized venue for students to learn some of these things. But we still know that utilization is pretty low, unfortunately, for students that do go to the Career Center. It's getting better, I think. Some of us are seeing on-campus strategies to increase different ways that we're reaching students, but it's still not where we want it to be. And again, like I mentioned before, widely promoted work-based learning or high-impact practices such as internships are just not available to all students. And this is just some of the data that we collected from our National Survey of College Internships, which is now, by the way, being hosted by Strata Education Network. And they're always on the lookout for institutions that want to participate in this growing national survey. But we found just, again, 1 in 5 students took an internship. With the pandemic, we saw a nosedive in some cities and regions placements. And so that's recovering a little bit, But the fact remains that a lot of students that didn't take an internship had wanted to. And so that raises a question, well, where can we reach the largest number of students? And to my mind, that remains the classroom. Now, one of the great things about this is that we have a decades-long effort pushing towards active learning. And this is generally, the shift from didactic lecturing, like I'm doing with all of you right now, showing slides, a real big shift from that to more engaged, hands-on, real-world learning. And so if and when these two movements kind of start aligning, I think we're going to be in a really great place as a field, but we're not seeing that completely yet. But there's a lot of stars that can be aligned. But again, the big challenge is many faculty haven't been trained in active learning or instructional design at all, much less how to emphasize skills, and especially from a cultural view. Fortunately, there's some disciplines such as communication studies, and this is a book on oral communication that I highly recommend. There's some subfields, medical education is another, you'll see in a minute, that are way ahead of the curve, that they're thinking about classroom-based skills instruction from a cultural and disciplinary perspective that I think all of us can learn from. One of the things that is really nice about the way that these communication scholars have approached this is really respecting disciplinary expertise. For some of you who have been engaged in educational reform, you may know the tendency for some reformers to do a top-down, telling faculty this is what you need to do. That rarely works in K-12 or higher ed. So respecting disciplinary expertise is key. And then really engaging in a backwards design process, which I'll talk about in a second. So a lot of teaching cultural scripts or transferable skills from this perspective really requires us rethinking instructional design. And one of the key ideas in instructional design and curriculum and instruction from the last couple of decades is backwards design. Don't assume students are learning just from covering the textbook, but really articulate a specific learning goal, and in this case, a skill. And then from there, you align your teaching methods and assessments from that learning goal. For many instructors, this is, again, a backwards way to think about it instead of just having a textbook and going through the chapters. But until and unless we articulate these skills as learning goals as we design a course or even a workshop, it's going to be very hard for students to really learn these because they're not going to be highlighted in the instruction. Active learning is also a key element in rethinking how we approach instructional design. Lecturing is okay. It's even essential, I will argue, as part of this, but when students are actively engaged in practicing these cultural scripts, that's when they're actually learning them. We need to scaffold these, though, so that students kind of work from a zone. Vygotsky called this a zone of proximal development, where students kind of shift from completely independent, they've mastered the basics, but we want to move them out of their comfort zone into a learning zone. But we don't want to throw them into the anxiety zone where experts live too quickly. We want them to go to where they're out of their comfort zone, but we're still there as instructors to help provide some feedback. And so scaffolding activities from easy to difficult is really important. And then finally, assessment. And this is where thinking about formative assessment is especially important for learning cultural scripts. Because just like teaching somebody how to be competent in Japanese culture if they're going to go visit Japan so that they don't look silly, you have to provide feedback. Like, this is how you use chopsticks. This is how you enter somebody's house. And so feedback, especially in the moment, is really important. Some specific examples of teaching methods. I'm just briefly going to go through this because I want to share with you a framework that I've developed for how faculty and curriculum specialists can think about the entire design process. But the teaching part is really at the heart of this. And you'll see role play and simulations, I think, are one of the best ways that we can teach cultural scripts, where students observe and then practice the script in simulated situations. These situations are often real world, they're authentic, and they're performed by experts. And until students see that, it's really difficult for them to master them. Small group discussions. Discussions like problem-based learning and some other approaches are really great because they combine communication, teamwork, critical thinking. A lot of these transferable skills we're interested in. In small group discussions, they can be train wrecks in a classroom or online if they're not designed well, but if they're designed with intention and expertly curated, they can be really rich opportunities for learning these skills. And then problem-based learning, that's probably the Cadillac, I think, and Pogel of teaching these skills, really grounded in the content, but they do take a lot more planning. They often take an entire semester. And so really thinking about, what are some of the small teaching methods we could have our faculty use, and then what are some of the big enchiladas, and then appropriately allocating them to different courses and different faculty who may be ready for the big Cadillac version. But the framework that I've developed has 2 phases, and the handout is posted on our center's website. And again, these slides are available on slideshare.net. But there's a planning phase and a teaching phase. The planning phase is, again, it's a backwards design process where faculty at the outset articulate the cultural script they want their students to learn. So maybe if this was a student affairs or future career services class, we would use the example of networking at a career fair. How do you engage with employers? So it's really important at the outset to define it, determine how it's linked to the content, maybe the history of career services, and then consider if and how the script may encode biases. And these could be biases from us as instructors, but also from the profession. And it's really important to think about some of our disciplines have some cultural scripts that we may not want to share with our students. And this is really important to think at the very beginning instead of later on where we realize, oops, that's something actually we're trying to get out of our discipline. After you identify the learning script or the learning goal, then comes picking assignments and assessments. And this is really a matter of alignment. Okay, so we have this script of teaching how to network at a career fair. What's the best assignment for that? Is it writing a research paper? Probably not. It's probably going to be something like a role player simulation. Then you have to think about how long should the assignment be, what kind of assessment we use, and so forth. And then the last part of the planning phase is selecting the teaching method. And again, this needs to align with each of these elements. And so in this case, again, it could be role play simulation, maybe a little bit of lecture, probably not a PowerPoint presentation or small group discussions. They may not be the best to actually get the script taught and learned by your students. So the second activity, if you just want to jot down some ideas, or if you just want to share out with the group, what are some ideas that you have of assignments, assessments, and teaching methods that are best aligned with the cultural script that you previously identified? And just think of the best ways to teach it and then evaluate it once students perform it or test on it in the classroom. So why don't we take a minute or two to think or write? Okay, anybody have some thoughts they'd like to share? Or if you were stumped, you can share that experience as well. Or if you have any questions.
Yeah, I'll jump in. For a number of years, we've been teaching a 4-credit course on business fundamentals, but embedding career education in it. And we have a mandatory, you've got to do 3 informational interviews with people you don't know. And then write a 2-page paper. Each one is really interesting, but I think the best part of the learning is when in the classroom, we ask the students, what did you expect to learn? What did you learn? And what are you going to do differently in your next informational interview? And in every single case, there's all kinds of fear of the unknown. And by the end of the 3rd informational interview, the students are saying, I should have been even better prepared because I got some great information. I wish I got more information. And so I think the combination of putting them in a context of a role that they might be interested in and learning how different that is from what they thought is really helpful. It gives them more of the cultural, whatever the issue is, you know, in terms of the industry or function they're interested in. And I think again, the best part of it is not them doing it, but then realizing what they have learned in the process and realizing that the other 30 students are also in the same boat.
Great, thank you, Jim. And that final stage of reflection is super important for learning in general. But one of the skills that I highlight in the course is self-regulated learning or self-directed learning, which is something I think we all want our students to develop, but there's pedagogical approaches like you just mentioned that really spark reflection. And that's when students start to realize, oh, you know, this is what I need to improve. This is what I need to work on. And that's a really important and valuable skill. I'm curious, Jim, if you could, do you think there's a cultural script that is part of this activity that you're trying to teach the students beyond just them learning about different, you know, fields or occupations that they may be interested in?
I think the way to respond to that is every student thinks they know what they want to do, and then they learn out, they want to do something different because they don't know what's out there. And they start understanding that the vocabulary, the tonality, the way they have their conversations with a sales and trader versus, you know, a potential medical doctor is very, very different. And I think that starts to come out.
That's really cool because that strikes me as this activity is putting students out into the field where they can gather data about cultural scripts in these different jobs. And that's really important. And I'm taking notes because this is a great idea, because I do hear from a number of instructors, well, I don't know what the cultural scripts are in my field because I'm in academia, or I haven't been in industry for 10 years. And so this is a great way to have students go out there and directly kind of collect cultural information, if you will, about how people think and talk in these different jobs. So thank you for sharing. That's wonderful. Okay, let's see. And Lindsay, you have role play. That's excellent. We're going to talk a little bit more about role play in a second. I want to briefly talk about teamwork. And again, this is one of the skills that are always on those lists of skills employers want. And it's one of the transferable skills that we emphasize in higher education. Cultural scripts may include coordinating among patient care team, working in a lab, and so forth. One of the important things that we have found in teaching, whether it's cooperative learning and education or how teams function from administrative science and business studies, is that preparatory work is essential before we put students in groups or design some sort of collaborative activity. And this is often overlooked, where we have to discuss with students what are some expectations and ground rules for behavior, what's appropriate, what's not, How do you deal with grading? What do you do about so-called slackers, the students who aren't doing anything? These are all things that need to be discussed with the students, preferably before any activity is pursued. This is something that a lot of research and people's personal experiences have shown. Another important thing is to think through the length of the activity. How are groups created? There's some really cool online tools now for randomizing group membership or even sorting based on age, GPA, and so forth. And then creating engaging tasks that really the group can sink their teeth into. It's much harder to do than you may think, unless you've done this, but it's something that has to really be deeply thought about. Now, on that note, though, there are some short-term, simple teaching approaches for teaching teamwork that I think need to be recognized. Simple one is think, pair, share, where you pose a question to students. They think about it independently, talk to their neighbor, and then maybe share with the larger group or the whole class. Many people don't think of this as teaching teamwork, but some students who are not used to talking in class or interacting with the person sitting next to them, this can break the ice and start to just gently get them down the road of working with their neighbors. You also have small group discussions where you can do simple or more complicated where you assign roles, and then role play simulations, which again, I think are one of the best ways to teach cultural scripts. This gets a little bit more elaborate. And then you have the longer term group projects that many of us think about when we think of teaching teamwork. But these can just be a one class session where people work in a group to solve a problem, or it could be a full semester. And this is where project-based learning comes into play. Another approach I've seen is classroom debate. This usually takes more than one class. It's often thought of as a communication or critical thinking mode of instruction. But in working with another classmate or a small group, and how do you prepare for the debate and how do you rebut certain arguments? There's a lot of teamwork and coordination that's also being taught. So I'd encourage you to think creatively about teaching teamwork. They often overlap with other skills in terms of pedagogical instruction. And there's a continuum of short-term, kind of easy to longer-term, more complicated. Now I wanted to show a short video, though, about a way to teach teamwork using a cultural script approach, because I do find that a lot of teamwork instructional practices do not pay attention to the fact that these skills are cultural and that they need to be modeled and shared. And I'm a huge fan of medical education, so we'll just watch part of this short video and you'll hopefully see what I'm talking about.
The idea of simulation really percolated through the medical school and through the School of Nursing about 2 years ago. And we've had multiple conversations because we all agree that simulation is a very important component of health education. The purpose of simulation is to give students an opportunity to rehearse skills, to learn about teamwork, to learn about roles, to learn about collaboration in a safe environment.
So there's 3 pieces to the project today, and each student will be here for about an hour and a half. The first one is the simulation itself, and basically the students are brought into a room. They're given the basics of the case, and then they're just turned loose to care for the patient. Following that, they each get a flash drive that has a tape, if you will, of what their performance was. So it's just a verbatim videotape that they watch themselves. And then after that, there's a 30-minute debriefing with one of our faculty. The debriefing is to get people to focus on, rather than the medical aspects for this particular case, the interactions that they had, how the group functioned together, and to give them some ideas for as they move forward in their careers, how they can be more effective as a member of a care team.
We have nurses and medical students, and we expect people when they get to the clinical setting to understand how to work together. But we don't necessarily provide those opportunities in an educational environment.
We're starting to introduce people into working together as members of care teams. And in some ways, we're breaking down traditional role barriers that have existed in healthcare before, and encouraging collaboration rather than ownership of different activities.
We hope they'll learn how to respect other people's contributions to healthcare. And we hope that we give them an opportunity to practice what worries them most, whatever that might be, and it's different from student to student, in a safe environment before they go into the clinical setting and start interacting with patients and families. Healthcare is growing increasingly complex. Patients are sicker. Technology is ever-changing. Therapies, interventions are always improving and evolving. And in order to assure that patients receive effective, safe care, all members of the team have to be communicating and collaborating. If it doesn't happen, then we know that patients do not receive the best care possible. There is ample evidence that collaboration and communication contribute to safe and high-quality care.
Okay, and so again, that was from University of Rochester. And one of the things that I think really brought home the importance of improving how we teach the so-called soft skills or transferable skills was some research, again, I did with my colleagues in healthcare in the oil and gas sector, where we heard time and again that we're not just teaching these skills so students can get jobs, we're teaching them because if we have people on an oil rig or an ER not communicating well or not teaching or working in a team well, then people can get hurt. And I feel that in some of these fields, the way that they teach these skills consequently is far more highly developed than in some other disciplines, hence my borrowing heavily from medical education. And you can imagine that instead of working with the simulated patient, you can translate this role play simulation to all sorts of disciplines and departments and academic programs. And there's lots of examples of that out there. Okay, so, oops, let me go back. The second part of the framework is the teaching phase. And this is after you've done the planning and you have your learning goal and your assignments and your general teaching approach. Actually, when you're in the classroom is where the rubber hits the road. And this comes from a lot of research on active learning, but also some of our own research on how people teach skills effectively. And the first step is lecture. And this is where I feel like there's a little bit too much denigration of lecturing as a pedagogical approach in the active learning world. But we do need to tell the students what the skill is and why it's important before we move to the next step of demonstrating it. This could either be through us as instructors demonstrating the cultural script in front of the classroom. I've seen people bring in guest lecturers or other experts to demonstrate, or you can show a videotape. This phase is really important too for demonstrating how not to do a cultural script, maybe how not to network at a career fair, or how not to do an informational interview. It's important for students to also see some of the things to avoid. The third step is then giving students opportunities to practice the script. This could be, breaking out into teams and then performing the role play, or whatever active learning method you're using. And then the last step is providing feedback. This could engage some sort of reflective practice like Jim was talking about, where students maybe reflect and provide feedback to themselves, but also at some point the expert, which is the instructor, should provide some feedback about the student's performance. And this is where I'm really emphasizing in this framework and my approach that in providing feedback, the instructor needs to think about what are the cultural backgrounds of all the students in the classroom, and how does that impact how they're performing the script? And does my own cultural background give me some biases about normative performance of scripts? Because we really need to be attentive to that, especially as our classrooms get more and more diverse. Some final thoughts I want to share with you. I've heard from a lot of people like, well, again, I'd like to know more cultural scripts in history or art history or chemistry or wherever. This is where working with employer relations or going out and doing informational interviews could be beneficial. I'm also trying to develop a catalog of cultural scripts that will be publicly available for people to use. Online instruction introduces a new twist to this, but it can be done. And actually, role play simulation with the pandemic has kind of been heightened to a much more robust level with online teaching. Inclusive pedagogy is important to fold into these conversations. And for further learning, I'm almost done revising this edX and Canvas course. Hopefully it'll be available midsummer, and then it'll be running from there on out. Thank you all for your time. And I know everybody's busy. You just shared an hour of your time and your day with me. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. And I think we have a couple minutes if anybody has any final comments or questions.
That was great. Thank you so much, Matthew.
I had one thought. So coming from a background of working with in a college of humanities, working with liberal arts students, and where as I'm thinking about this and thinking about like the massive variety of career paths that those students are going to be taking, it's hard to like identify which scripts would we focus on, which scripts would we involve. But one thing I really liked from the video that you shared was this idea of how they were integrating the reflection piece. And really, I guess, helping to give students the ownership of starting to think about how they were enacting, whatever scripts they were enacting, how they were enacting them, and then think about what that was looking like. Because I feel like in a situation where you're working, for example, with liberal arts students, maybe that's really the key there, is helping them to be cognizant, helping them to be able to reflect and start to articulate how they're approaching things, so that when they get into whatever context they end up getting into, they have the ability to understand what's going on around them and then adjust accordingly.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. That's a great point. And I think if these scripts and transferable skills, whatever you want to call them, are taught well, it should be a robust learning opportunity where students are learning something about a script, but also the content, because they should all be linked to course content. But then just how to think and how to reason. And if that reflective practice is built in, then that can only be a good thing in my view. But it is tricky for liberal arts students or those without a specific career trajectory. But I think, just thinking back to Jim's informational interviewing, it could only be beneficial for students who may not have like a declared major, just to see, oh, that's something they do in accounting, or that's what they do in a bench lab. I find that a lot of students, and this is kind of scary and surprising, I guess, but even juniors and seniors, they don't know what the work is like in the career they want to go into. They have no idea. And so the more we can introduce them, I think, to actual real world scripts, the better. But thank you for that comment. Any other final observations or comments? All right. Well, thank you all again for joining. Have a great rest of your Thursday, May 11th, and spring or summer, wherever you are. And yeah, have a good one. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Matt.